As we go through this, I'll also encourage you to reflect on what ethical situations do you expect that people face in a healthcare career? What role does faith play in ethics in healthcare? Plato noted that moral values also are absolute truths and thus are also abstract spirit-like entities. Ethical principles of research in healthcare are recent developments. The origin of the Nuremberg Code began in pre-World War II German politics, particularly during the 1930s and 1940s. Starting in the mid-1920s, German physicians were accused by the public and the medical society of unethical medical practices. In response to the criticism of unethical human experimentation, the Reich government issued guidelines for new therapy and human experimentation in Weimar, Germany. The guidelines were based on beneficence and non-maleficence, but also stressed legal doctrine of informed consent. The guidelines clearly distinguished the difference between therapeutic and non-therapeutic research. However, the guidelines from Weimar were negated by Adolf Hitler. After World War II, a series of trials were held to hold members of the Nazi Party responsible for a multitude of war crimes. Doctors working with the prosecution developed 10 points for legitimate medical research, which became known as the Nuremberg Code, which includes principles such as informed consent, the absence of coercion, properly formulated scientific experimentation, and beneficence towards experiment participants. It is thought to have been mainly based on the Hippocratic Oath, which was interpreted as endorsing the experimental approach to medicine while protecting the patient. The Belmont Report is a critical document for those involved in research. However, the report is also applicable to clinical practice. The primary purpose of the Belmont Report is to protect the rights of all research subjects or participants. The Belmont Report also serves as an ethical framework for research. There are three main components: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Normative ethics is the study of what is right or wrong. There are 4 key questions in normative ethics. First, what kind of acts are right? Second, are there general principles or norms describing the characteristic that makes actions right or wrong? Third question, how do rules apply to specific situations? Individuals may differ in their belief about rules to some specific situation. Some rigorists insist that rules should never be violated. Some situationalists claim that rules never apply because each situation is unique. Neither extreme is especially useful in evaluating ethical conflicts in a complex world. The fourth question, what ought to be done in specific cases? This is the real-life level where decisions must be made. This decision should be guided by the answers to the previous 3 questions. Before going further, let's consider a common situation in healthcare that requires us to use ethical principles and make ethical judgments. There are 2 major schools of thought that dominate Western theories about what kinds of acts are right within this realm of normative ethics. The first is consequentialism. It looks at the consequences or the utility of acts. This category of theory claims that acts are right to the extent that they produce good consequences and wrong to the extent that they produce bad ones. A key question is, will this act produce the most good for all? Classical utilitarianism counts benefits to all in society equally. In other words, there are no special cases. Then we can look at non-consequentialism, which asserts that rightness and wrongness are inherent in the act itself, independent of the consequences. That's why it's called rule ethics. Thus, doing the right thing may not always lead to an increase in the good or the utility, and more specifically, the good for all. One of the most ancient ethical perspectives, traced back to Plato and Aristotle, derives from an emphasis on the character of the moral agent. Virtue ethics addresses the questions, what sort of person should I be? How should we live together? And there are 4 major principles that guide ethical decision-making in healthcare. These principles are embedded in the professional codes of ethics. These include autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Let's look at non-maleficence, which means to do no harm. The original Hippocratic Oath was written in iconic Greek between the 3rd and 5th centuries BC. It was about first doing no harm, providing benefit only. Note that harm can also be negligence by not doing a procedure that could benefit a patient, or by not following due diligence. There is also a harm in violating a patient's autonomy and not following through on their wishes. Beneficence means to do good. Altruism is a self-care for the well-being of others. But beneficence is more than just the opposite of non-maleficence. It is more than just not doing harm. It's actually seeking to do good for others. Next is autonomy. This operates by the assumption that each person can make their own decisions. It's important to make sure that patients are competent and free of coercion in making their decisions. Not all patients are competent to make their own health decisions, and at times family members or others may influence the patient into decisions that are not their own. This could be true in the situation of an abused spouse or other situations that may arise. If someone is deemed incompetent and their original wishes are known, they should be followed. If their wishes are unknown, then the best interest or the assumption of what a reasonable person would choose in that situation should be followed. Justice is treating people fairly. This means that everyone should be afforded access to the same treatment options. For example, donors to the hospital shouldn't get priority of treatments or access to vaccines over others. Here are some of the major ethical challenges in healthcare. Conflict of interest. This means that providers can't take promotions from pharmaceuticals and device companies, things like free samples, lunches, etc., and they can't have financial ties to those companies. Balancing profit with serving patients and providing charity care. Should organizations invest scarce resources in profit-making areas that are likely to serve a relatively small number of patients, or in an area that will provide basic care to a larger number of patients? In this day of healthcare as a big business with limited resources, organizations and individuals are challenged to retain the patient as the highest priority. It is crucial for healthcare institutions to support good care through ethically sound policy, clear and fair processes, and ongoing ethics education for patient care providers at all levels, and through access to a clinical ethics consultation service that can consult with clinicians on difficult cases. Equal treatment is a big factor. Do donors and other influential people receive priority care? The question is whether consistently the hospital treats people who are wealthy or who are donors differently than the general public. Consider the case of an organ transplant. Should a Nobel Prize winner have priority over a school custodian for a heart transplant? Pediatric and geriatric patients may not be capable of making their own healthcare decisions. This challenges autonomy. If a patient can't give informed consent to a medical provider, then the responsibility falls to his or her legally authorized representative. That person is supposed to decide, based on the patient's known preferences or best interest, what happens when no legal representative has been designated? Or what if the legal representative's values and choices conflict with other family members? Distress about providing care for minimal benefit. This comes into play often with end-of-life care. Blending a formal ethics policy and support mechanisms with a culture that allows people to discuss some of the gray areas of their practice can prepare clinicians to tackle many of these problems in stride. To aid in regulating the behavior of healthcare professionals, professional organizations have adopted codes of ethics.